Fans of this podcast will know that last week I went off script. I stopped talking about backups and cyber recovery, and I talked about California and what's going on here in the elections in California. At this point, it's now been a week later. I got some comments. I got a lot of views on that, a lot of listens on that particular episode, and I'm glad for that. I hope that it helped some people. But I also got a lot of comments, and I got a lot of comments about, other or specific claims about voter fraud. And some of them are crazy. Almost all of them are completely false. And almost all of them are based on a tiny, like any good lie, right? It's based on a tiny morsel of truth. And in one case, believe it or not, I was as surprised as you will be. One of them, possibly the craziest one, was actually true. You'll have to wait till the end. I'm gonna save the good stuff to the end. Hi folks, Dr. Mike Saylor and I have just published our new book, Learning Ransomware Response and Recovery. Most books on this subject tell you how not to get ransomware. We actually took a different approach. We start by acknowledging the odds of your organization getting hit by some kind of ransomware are virtually 100%. So instead of pretending that we can prevent all of it, we teach you how to prepare for it, respond, and recover. Ransomware is inevitable. Recovery is a choice. Check it out at stopransomware.com. And so I'm going to do an episode on these specific claims of voter fraud. And I'm going to give you the details. I'm going to give references so that you can check my work, right? I don't want you to believe me. Just go directly to the source of data. And most of these things, they just make no sense if you actually understand how things actually work here, or if you just sort of apply some logic. But again, I'll show my work when I can. I want to talk especially about the mayoral race in Los Angeles, because that, for some reason, got a ton of attention. And probably because, in this case, Spencer Pratt, the Republican candidate, did not make the primary. Here in California, we have what's called a jungle primary, where we don't have party or primary. This is for state races that we don't have a sort of a typical primary. We have a jungle primary, which means the top two people who get the most votes advance to the general election. And if those two people happen to be from the same party, so be it. And believe it or not, a few months ago, the way things were looking, we were actually thinking that we were going to get an all-Republican race because Eric Swalwell was not looking good in the polls, and Steve Hilton was looking better, and Chad Bianco, which is a sheriff in Riverside, was looking better than Eric Swalwell, who was the leading candidate at the time. But Eric Swalwell dropped out for SA allegations, and rightly so. And that basically blew things up. And there was a toss-up. And then suddenly Becerra became much more popular in the Democrat side. And so we ended up with a very different race on the governor's side. My point is that there was a time when we thought we were actually going to end up with Steve Hilton and Chad Bianco as the two candidates for governor. That there were too many Democrat candidates, and they were splitting up the vote, and so that's how we thought we were going to end up with those two candidates. But things changed after Eric Swalwell dropped out. The popularity centered around Becerra and Tom Steyer. What ended up happening there was, just like often happens in California, because you get a lot of people who vote early and a lot of Republicans. Basically, this happened in both the governor's race and the mayor race, but the LA mayor race, but the results were different. So what happens is that the Republicans are being told by their leadership, you should vote on or before the election day, and you should vote in person, and you should vote, that basically they have this strong belief that your ballot should get in by election day, that waiting to the last possible minute to drop off your ballot is somehow wrong, even though it's in keeping with California law. And so Republicans tend to either vote in person at the polls or send in their mail ballot early. And whereas Democrats, especially in this particular election, were voting very strategically, and they didn't have a problem with putting in a last-minute mail ballot. And that's really important to understand. And by the way, that what I just said comes from the statement is just, it's a big generalization, and not everybody did that. But I think the data bears that out. You see what happened in the state race, and you see what happened in the mayor race. And I can now talk about it in the past tense. So what happened was you saw a lot of, there was a huge surge of mail-in ballots dropped off on or just before Election Day. And that meant that they had to validate the signatures on a ton of ballots. So in the case of San Diego County, it was roughly 800,000 ballots that were turned in on Election Day. Actually, a very small number. Last time I checked, it was like 30,000 that came in after Election Day. But again, in California, as long as it's postmarked by Election Day and received within a week of Election Day, those ballots would still be counted. And yes, I know that there's a Supreme Court case on the docket right now trying to see whether or not that the Supreme Court decides that that's legal. So you had this big surge. And because of how Republicans tend to vote, the surge and the votes that would then be verified after Election Day, not just the ones that came in after Election Day, but just the ballots that all came in on Election Day, they tended to lean Democratic in California, and even more so in Los Angeles. And so the results were different between the two. And there were all these accusations of fraud because it's statistically impossible. That was a phrase I saw all last week. It's statistically impossible for it to rocket off like that. The only way is that they're making up votes or they're not counting. That was basically all the conspiracy theories were one way or the other. Either they're making up fake votes or they're not counting real votes for the Republican candidates. And neither of those things has any basis in fact. And so one of the things that you saw, and you see it still repeated to this day, was there was this one moment when there was a vote count reported by the Associated Press where one of the candidates got, they use the word a tranche of ballots, right? They tend to report them in batches, right? In San Diego, they do them once a day. And then there was this one moment, and I do say moment, where they had added something like 30,000 ballots to Nitya Raman and 0 ballots to Spencer Pratt. People made a comment, and then the AP realized it was a reporting error, and they fixed the reporting error. If you look at the official record on the Los Angeles site, that's tranche by tranche, there is no time when a bunch of votes got added to one candidate and no votes added to Spencer Pratt. It was simply a reporting error. AP has said it's a reporting error. It was investigated by the U.S. attorney, and it's just not an event. But people keep bringing it up. Okay, so that's just completely false. The other is this idea that it's the opposite of this, and that is that you're seeing claims on social media that tens of thousands of Spencer Pratt voters are having their mail ballots rejected for signature verification. And the implication there is that they're just rejecting the Spencer Pratt votes, and that if they had just accepted these Spencer Pratt votes, that Spencer Pratt could have won over Nitya Raman. And the thing is that neither of those things are true. So the first reason that it's not true is that the ballots are all in the same colored envelope, right? Regardless of your party, your mail-in ballot comes in. It looks exactly the same as the other person's mail-in ballot, and the ballot isn't opened and no one looks inside that ballot until the signature verification process is complete. And so the idea that they were somehow figuring out what was in these mail ballots and then rejecting ballots because they were Spencer Pratt is simply not possible, because that's just not how it works, right? The signature verification process happens before the envelope is ever opened. So the idea that they could somehow reject just Spencer Pratt votes is simply not possible. And second, even if that was the case, which it's not, even if that was the case, the number of votes that were rejected for signature issues were 12,702 in the entire Los Angeles County, which means that for the Los Angeles mayor, it's going to be some number less than that. The LA County didn't give a number for the Los Angeles city, but they gave a number for Los Angeles County. And that was the margin of votes between Pratt and Rahman was 30,000. So even if all 12,700 votes, which weren't even all Los Angeles city votes, even if all of them were Spencer Pratt votes, and then they all passed signature verification, and they were all added to it, it wouldn't have changed the results of the race. So that's just completely false from beginning to end and makes absolutely no sense. I would also like to just point out, this isn't it's not one of the claims that I'm refuting, but this idea that why in the world, if the Democrat Party wanted to, the fix was in, what they want is they want this person in, okay? So if they wanted the Democrat, obviously they have a preferred Democrat, whether it's Bass or Rahman. They have a preferred Democrat. If they wanted to fix the election, then they would have more than likely, again, they didn't do this, but if they would have fixed it so that they were running against Pratt. Because in Los Angeles, it's one of the most liberal cities in the United States. They would have set it up so that their preferred candidate, whether that was Bass or Rahman, was running against Pratt, because he just isn't going to get enough votes in Los Angeles County to win. It's just not going to happen. And so if they wanted to fix the election, that's the way they would have fixed it. They wouldn't have kicked them out. Now what we have is the current mayor is now battling a very popular, very progressive candidate. This is honestly a toss-up. Who knows what's going to be the results of this waste? So if somebody was trying to fix things, they sure didn't fix it very well. I also want to just, again, going back to the mayoral race, I think it's really important to note that Spencer Pratt got 26% of the vote. Why does that matter? Ask yourself, what percentage of the vote did Donald Trump get when he was running for president in Los Angeles County? You know what that percentage was? 27%. So Spencer Pratt got almost exactly the same percentage of votes that Donald Trump got in the 2024 election. It's just nonsense. Again, no basis in fact. Now let's talk about the fact that there was a surge of ballots both in the governor race and the LA mayor race. There was a surge, and there was one candidate took off at a much greater rate than the Republican candidate, right? So in the case of the governor race, Becerra really took off after the election, and they started verifying signatures. And Steyer took off at a faster rate than Hilton, but not at a rate enough to catch up to him and overtake him the way that things happen in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, if you look at the votes, actually after the election, there was sort of a rocket-like phenomenon on Rahman. So a lot of people are like, look at that. It's, again, statistically impossible. She's more popular than Bass in the latter half of thing when they were counting votes. So let's just talk about this. The first one with the governor's race, it's just the red mirage. I talked about this on the last episode. Republicans tend to vote earlier because I think that's the right thing to do. They think that the way the Democrats are voting in California is just fundamentally wrong. I've talked to a lot of them online. It's just wrong, right? It's just wrong the way they vote in California. And so they tend to vote early, or they tend to vote in person, which means that the bulk, not all, but more than not, The mail-in ballots, especially ones turned in towards the end, are going to lean heavily Democratic. And so it's not a surprise. This is why they call it the red mirage, right? The same thing happened to Donald Trump in 2020. They had initially thought he was winning, but then as they started counting the mail ballots in some states, then he ended up losing that particular election. But what happened in the mayor race was, I think if you don't have any context, if you just look at it without any knowledge of the way Democrats were thinking in California, then it does look a little suspect, okay? So let me explain what I think happened. Again, I don't have proof for this, but when I look at the numbers, this is what I think happened. I do have some anecdotal evidence to suggest that the same thing happened to Steyer that happened to Rahman. It's just the results were different. So I talked to more than a handful of people who were voting for not their preferred candidate. In this case, they were voting for Steyer and not Becerra. I don't live in Los Angeles. I didn't speak to any LA voters, but I did speak to people who were voting for Steyer, even though they wanted Becerra to win. Now, why would they do that? It makes no sense. The reason was that at some point, especially later in the race, meaning as we were getting close to the election, it looked like Becerra was in, right? Becerra was going to win, so he was definitely going to be in the top two. And so because of the jungle primary, people said, well, if he's going to win, I'd like to see if we can kick the Republican out. I'd like to see if we can oust the Republican due to the jungle primary out of the governor's race altogether, like what happened in Los Angeles. And so they voted for Steyer, even though when it came to the general election, they were going to vote for Becerra. I talked to multiple voters who were doing exactly that. Personally, I disagree with that tactic. I would rather vote for the guy that I think should win, and I want to win, and I would vote for that candidate. I'm not a fan of the jungle primary. I'll just say that. I'd rather have a person of each party and let them duke it out in the general. But to me, that's a risky vote. But I talked to multiple people. That's what they're doing. Now let's go over to the mayor race. So in here we have an incumbent, right? So the incumbent, Bass, again, the polls were saying she's in there, right? She's going to essentially win the primary. She's going to get the most votes in the primary. So really all we're arguing about is the second vote, that she's popular enough as the current mayor that she was going to be in there, right? And this is what I think happened. I don't know this because I didn't talk to anybody specifically, but I think they did the same thing with Rahman that they did with Steyer. They wanted Bass to win, or maybe they'd be okay with either candidate, but what they really wanted was they wanted for the Republican not to be in the primary at all. They'd be comfortable with either Democrat, but they don't want the Republican in the primary at all. And so they knew Bass was going to get enough votes to qualify. And so they went ahead towards the end, right at the end, right? They put in a ballot, not just a Democratic ballot, but a ballot for Rahman. And they mailed some of those at the last minute, or they put them in at the last minute. And the result was that once they started counting mail ballots, actually Rahman took off like a rocket at a higher rate than Bass did. And she took off fast enough to overtake Spencer Pratt. It makes perfect sense to me. Again, I know that there are plenty of you probably listening that are saying, you shouldn't do it that way. Well, that's the way we do it here in California. And it makes sense. It doesn't in any way spell fraud. It just says that the way we do ballots in California, that I definitely know people that were strategically voting and giving that other vote to the other candidate. And I think that's what happened in her case. Will she win in the actual general? Who knows, right? So that's the whole late surge thing. So here's another one, and it sounds kind of crazy, and it's the one that has the most kernel of truth so far. And that is, man, over there in California, you can just register to vote with a gym membership card. And that's not true at all, but it sort of is. So here's what it is. When you register to vote in California, you need to give identifying information. So because when you're filling out an application to register, or you're filling out a conditional voter registration at the polls, you need to give enough information for them to verify that you are a real person and a resident of California. And Now, notice I did not mention citizenship status there. And I'm going to be very open here. I don't want to speak for the different registrars, but I couldn't find any evidence that there was any official attempt to verify the citizenship status of people when they register. They just have to, under penalty of perjury, certify that they are a citizen, right? And doing so, if you're not a citizen, is a felony, right? And then voting with that registration would then be another felony. And again, there have been, and some of you are listening and go, aha, there it is, there's the fraud. No, there's the possibility of fraud, sure, but there's no evidence of any significant amount of non-citizens voting, and trust me, groups have looked for that. And I also want to throw this out is they're like, oh, it's so crazy there in California, they no rules, no whatever. Again, I researched this, and what I found was that only 6 states require proof of citizenship to vote. It's not just crazy California, right? Again, most states, the bulk of states, they simply require that you, under penalty of perjury, certify that you are a citizen. One of the reasons for this is that it's actually quite difficult to electronically prove you're a citizen. So and this is what the whole discussion around the SAVE Act, proving you're a citizen can be challenging for a lot of people. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just suffice it to say that it's not that easy to prove that you're a citizen for certain groups of people, especially married women and older people who were born in various states in different times when getting easy access to your birth records is not easy, or if you've changed your name, or all sorts of things, right? Or if you, there's just a bunch of people where that is not the case. Anyway, I just want you to understand that the majority of states, all but 6 that I could find, do the same thing as California, where they require you to affirm. Now, what is this gym membership thing? So here's the thing. There was the Help America Vote Act of 2002, I believe it was. And this was back after the Gore-Bush election. And this act did a bunch of things. One of the things it did was it got rid of the punch card ballots. Remember the hanging Chad, right? And by the way, just, as a computer person, Chad is a plural word like confetti. There's no such thing as a hanging Chad. Anyway, a piece of Chad, sure. But anyway, you remember that. The HAVA Act, Help America Vote Act, it did a bunch of things like set standards for paper ballots and require paper ballots, and get rid of voting machines, which is a machine where you vote on and it stores your vote. So we got rid of those. And because the Constitution does specify that the time and manner of elections is determined by the states, except where laws are passed by Congress. Okay. And this was an example where Congress basically came out and said, you've got to do this. You can't use these punch card ballots. We got too many problems of them in Florida. And so you got to do that. But one of the things that it also stated was some requirements on mail registration and CVRs, conditional voter registrations. And it said that if you do this, you need to give them a unique number. So use their driver's license, the last 4 of their social security number, or some state ID number. You need to give them a number, and then someone needs to check ID the first time they vote in a national election. And there is a list of IDs, as I make quotes, things that can help verify your identity that is eligible in many states. I will agree that the list is longer in California. And one thing on that list, so assuming you registered to vote, assuming your identity was verified electronically, not your citizenship, but your identity was verified, now you're coming to vote for the first time, you need to verify that the person standing in front of them is the person that filled out the application. And one of the things on that, called a HAVA ID list, is a gym membership card. And I'm sure some of you are like, first off, let me just tell you something. As somebody who's worked every election for the last 10 years in California, and I train in every election on HAVA ID requirements. They're like, if when you go to check somebody in, it's going to beep up, it's going to say HAVA ID required. Here's what to do. In 10 years, I have never seen a HAVA ID. And not just me, but I'm a site manager, and I tell them, if anybody ever sees a HAVA ID, I want to know about it. And since we changed things in California, we almost never do provisionals. I tell them, if you do a provisional, probably something's wrong, so call me over, right? So if we ever had a HAVA ID, I would know, and I've never seen one. So my point is, this is a really rare scenario of this person no one has ever seen this person with an ID. And so now we need to verify that the person's standing in front of it. So it's called a HAVA ID check. And in that one scenario, the only thing we need to verify is that is the person. And and one of the things that's on that list is a gym membership. Now, why is that valid? I'm not really going to make a case for it too strong, but what I will say is that in order to get a gym membership with an ID, like that's generally going to be something with an automatic debit. Every gym I've joined has always wanted an automatic debit, which means they need to identify with who you are. You need to sign a contract. The contract needs to match the bank that they're going to do an automatic debit from. So it's a little bit more valuable than you might think. In other states and in California, you can also use things like a utility bill, right? I would argue that the utility bill is a whole lot easier to forge than a laminated gym membership card with an ID. But anyway, that's what the whole gym membership card thing is. Okay. The next thing that I saw is Nitya Raman. There's no way that she got as many votes. She didn't even carry her own district. Well, that's just false, right? Like, you will say that she lost 54 out of 66 precincts in the California District 4, which is her district. You're like, well, look, she lost. But here, this is, if you've been following this, one of the things you hear is land doesn't vote, people do. She did win in the populous districts in her own district. She did win her district, okay? And when she was elected to city council, there was a runoff, and she got more than half of that runoff. And so this idea that she lost her own district, then how could she possibly win the city? One other crazy thing that has come up a lot, and that people on Skid Row are being paid to vote. And that is false. But I saw a video. Yeah, you saw a video. And by the way, some people were being paid to do something. It was they weren't being paid to vote. So what was going on there? And by the way, what was going on was wrong, was a crime, and the woman has pled guilty. So in California, we have this concept of petitions, and that you can get anything on the ballot if you get enough signatures. For example, in November, we do have voter ID on the ballot for the November general election, right? And also, if that passes, they would require them to check for citizenship when people register to vote. So she was a paid petitioner, meaning a person who goes out to get signatures for a petition. And that is legal to pay someone to go out and get signatures. And it is very common to pay them by the signature. But California law requires anyone who signs these petitions to be a registered voter. So she was doing two things that I can see in the video. I watched multiple videos. I saw two things going on. One, that if people weren't registered to vote, she was allowing them to register to vote, basically fill out the paperwork to register to vote. And once they had done that, they were then a registered voter. And so they could sign their name on the petition. And then the second one, and I don't know which of these is worse, but the second one is she had a list of registered voters, and she was then having them impersonate those registered voters and sign their name on the petition. And she would give them the name that they're supposed to sign and the address. So in the case of the first one, there's nothing wrong with getting them to register to vote. There's nothing wrong with the fact that they were on Skid Row, that they were homeless, that they were unhoused, whatever word you want to use there. That is not illegal to help homeless people register to vote. Homeless people are allowed to vote without an address, right? They do need to verify their identity. But again, one of the things that I'm trained to do is to help an unhoused person do a conditional voter registration. We find out where they are currently living, even if that's a tent on the corner of A and B. And the reason for that is that we need to know where they live so that we know which races they're going to vote on. We identify physically where they are sleeping, and then that's the race that they get to vote on. I'm absolutely sure that some of you think, well, that's just crazy. That's the way we do it here. And actually, I think I'm willing to guess that many states have a formal policy for what to do with homeless people and their ability to vote. And I'm sure that there are probably some other states that say you have to have a stationary address or whatever. So what she was doing is that if they wanted to register to vote, she was allowing them to use her address or a central address to register to vote. What she was doing was she was paying them to do that. She was paying them like $2 to $5 to register to vote. And that is a federal crime. Okay. That's what she was charged with, paying people to register to vote. The other thing that she was doing, which is she was having them impersonate somebody in order to sign a state petition. That is a felony within California. I haven't heard anything there, but in terms of what they're doing with that, but people are like, see, voter fraud. Not really. At least not the type of voter fraud that we've been talking about. This is technically voter fraud because you're doing stuff with voters, but nobody was being paid. I find no evidence that she was paying anybody to vote. She was paying them to register just so they could sign the petition that she's getting paid by the signature for. And by the way, even if they were paid to vote, they're not going to get mail ballots because they don't have a regular address. And so they would have to go in person. And if they're going in person, then they're going to be in a booth all by themselves. So if you're paid to vote for a particular candidate, you go into a booth, no one's going to know that you voted or didn't vote for that particular candidate. So it'd be a really weird thing to do. You could strongly encourage that they vote for somebody, but there's just no way to know what they end up doing. But again, I saw no evidence that she was paying people to vote, which is something that I heard alleged 100 times in the last week. Okay, I promised you a good one. I promised you one that turned out to actually be true, and this is it. There was a woman in Orange County that successfully registered her dog to vote and voted as the dog. And when she did this, she said that she was doing it to make a point. She is one of those who thinks that we do things wrong here, and she proved her point by successfully registering her dog to vote and then voting as that dog. And she's like, see, voter fraud. And we're like, yeah, voter fraud, that's a felony. She was convicted and sentenced for that crime, okay? So is this not evidence of voter fraud? It is evidence that there was a single incident of voter fraud that was done on purpose to make a point. It's still not evidence that there is widespread voter fraud. I will agree. I think I've already agreed that that should not have happened. And I hope that in Orange County, which is right up the road here, that they need to do a better job of verifying the identity of a person. I will say that when you have, in San Diego County's case, 2 million voters, you may make mistakes, right? In any large data size, you're going to have mistakes. Even if we had some sort of citizenship verification, I think there still may be mistakes. So that mistake was made, and it's wrong that mistake was made. I do think it's important to point out that she was flagged and that she was convicted, and then she is being sentenced for that crime. And by the way, the same is true. I'm glad I brought this. The same is true of a handful of people who actually, I don't know if some of you saw this on social media, people saying that because they don't check ID in California, we're just going to go over there. We're going to fly over to California and we're going to vote for Spencer Pratt because they don't check ID in California. The thing is, we do check ID in California. That's right. We check ID. Not in the way you think, meaning we don't check your ID, a card, but we do identify you when you come to vote. You have to fill out a conditional voter registration to vote. And if you are then found to be falsifying that voter registration, that is a felony. And there were a few people that were caught attempting to do that, and they are being prosecuted. So speaking of prosecuting and the Justice Department, another thing that is cited as evidence that things are topsy-turvy over in California is that the Justice Department is opening up an investigation in California. Just the fact that the Department of Justice is saying that they're going to open an investigation, and they're saying things like, and we expect some arrests. The fact that investigation has allegedly, because we don't actually know if it's been open or if they're just saying they're going to open an investigation, that means absolutely nothing. So that's it. That's what I got. I'm going to put as much as I can up here in terms of the evidence and stuff. I'll put it on the website. I'll put it in the video version of this. But again, with one exception, no actual proof of any kind of voter fraud, and perfectly valid explanations for the other things that you saw. With that, I'm going to get back to my regularly scheduled programming next week. That's a wrap.